March 28th, 1942. 1:34 in the morning. The Loire estuary, occupied France. A British destroyer built in 1919, one of 50 obsolete American warships handed to Britain 2 years earlier in exchange for basing rights, drives herself at 19 knots straight into the steel gates of the largest dry dock on the Atlantic coast. The impact rides her 33 feet up onto the caisson and wedges her there. Packed inside her bow, hidden in a steel and concrete case beneath the waterline, sits 4 tons of explosive on a delayed acid pencil fuse. German searchlights sweep the estuary. 28 coastal guns and 43 anti-aircraft batteries have already opened fire on the flotilla that brought her in. This obsolete destroyer was never meant to survive the run up the river. She was built to be expended the moment she hit the gate. 10 hours later, with German officers and dock workers standing on her deck to inspect the wreck, she detonated, killing over 360 of them and destroying the only dock on the entire European Atlantic coast, large enough to service the battleship Tirpitz. This is how a discarded First World War destroyer, sacrificed on a single mission, kept Germany's most powerful battleship boxed in for the rest of the war. By late 1941, the Admiralty faced a specific and narrow problem. Tirpitz, sister ship to Bismarck, was operational in Norwegian waters, and if she broke out into the Atlantic to raid convoys, she needed somewhere to go for repairs afterward. Only one facility on the entire occupied Atlantic coastline could take her, the Forme Écluse at Saint-Nazaire, better known as the Normandy dock, built in the 1930s to service the ocean liner Normandy, and large enough for any warship afloat. Deny Germany that dock, and Tirpitz's operational range shrank to a round trip she could not safely make. Any raid into the Atlantic became a one-way risk, because a damaged Tirpitz would have nowhere on the French coast to go. She would be forced back through the heavily patrolled waters around Britain to reach a German yard. Combined Operations Headquarters concluded that destroying one lock gate, roughly 167 by 54 feet, at a heavily fortified port over 400 miles from the nearest safe British harbour, would neutralize one of the most powerful warships in the world without firing a shot at the ship itself. Conventional options were ruled out fast. Bombing the dock from the air risked scattering damage across the town, while leaving reinforced concrete structures largely intact. And precision at night in 1942 was nowhere near reliable enough to guarantee a hit on a single gate. A full naval bombardment meant capital ships steaming into range of Saint-Nazaire's coastal batteries, an unacceptable risk after the losses already suffered in French waters. What the plan needed was a battering ram large enough to carry a serious explosive charge, shallow enough in draft to cross the mudflats guarding the estuary at high tide, and expendable enough that losing it entirely was an acceptable outcome. The Royal Navy did not have a purpose-built vessel for that job. It had HMS Campbeltown, formerly USS Buchanan, a flush-deck Wicks-class destroyer laid down in 1918, already 23 years old, one of the 50 aging American destroyers transferred to Britain under the 1940 Destroyers for Bases Agreement. She had spent the war so far on unglamorous convoy escort duty. She was, by any conventional measure, obsolete. Conversion took weeks. 2 of her 4 funnels were removed, and the remaining 2 cut down and angled to mimic the silhouette of a German Muir-class torpedo boat, intended to buy the ship precious minutes of confusion as she approached the port under a German ensign. Extra armor plating was welded around her bridge and wheelhouse to protect the crew from the machine gun fire she would draw at point-blank range. Most of her original weight, including much of her superstructure, was stripped out to lighten her draft for the shallow run over the mudflats. In her bow, engineers packed 4 tons of amatol explosive into a specially built steel tank encased in concrete to focus the blast and to disguise it from a casual German inspection. Fitted with delayed action pencil fuses, timed to detonate long after any survivors had escaped. She was accompanied by a flotilla of 18 small wooden fair-mile motor launches, a motor gunboat, and a motor torpedo boat, carrying commandos whose job was to land the moment Campbeltown struck and demolish the dock's pumping machinery, winding gear, and lock mechanism so thoroughly that even an intact gate would be useless. The run-in on the night of the 27th was built entirely on deception holding for as long as possible. The flotilla crossed the channel and approached the Loire flying German naval ensigns using a captured German signal code book to answer challenges from shore. German shore batteries, uncertain of the flotilla's identity, hesitated. Campbeltown crossed the outer mudflats, tore through a submarine boom net, and held her course under increasing fire as the deception finally broke down. She lost 2 helmsmen to machine gun fire in the final approach. At 1:34 a.m., she struck the caisson at 19 knots. The impact so severe that her bow crumpled and drove the explosive charge directly against the gate, closer than any plan could have specified. If you're finding this deep dive into Royal Navy history interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. What followed was not a clean extraction. Commandos poured off Campbeltown and fought through the dock complex, demolishing pump houses and winding gear under sustained fire from German garrison troops, who vastly outnumbered them. The motor launches meant to carry the raiders home were shredded by coastal gunfire. Most were sunk, set ablaze, or disabled before they could take on a single man. Of 611 men who took part, 169 were killed and 215 were captured, and only 228 made it back to Britain, several after fighting their way overland and escaping through Spain. It was, by any conventional accounting, a costly raid with a small landing force largely destroyed. But the objective was never really the men. It was the 4 tons sitting in Campbeltown's bow. At 10:35 the next morning, with German officers touring the wedged wreck and dock workers gathered on her deck to inspect the unusual American-built destroyer, the delayed fuses reached 0. The explosion tore through the ship and the gate simultaneously, killing over 360 German personnel and destroying the caisson beyond field repair. 2 days later, torpedoes fired into the harbour by the last surviving motor torpedo boat detonated as a final delayed strike, wrecking the old submarine basin's lock gate as well, and deepening the panic and confusion already gripping the German garrison. The Normandy dock did not return to operational use for the remainder of the war. Tirpitz never sailed for it, never had the option to sail for it, and spent the rest of her career confined to Norwegian fjords, harassed by midget submarines and bombers, sunk at anchor in 1944 without ever firing her main guns at an Atlantic convoy. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the raid, including one to Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, who commanded Campbeltown on her final run, and one posthumously to Sergeant Thomas Durrant of the Royal Engineers, who kept firing from an exposed gun position aboard a motor launch until he was killed. HMS Campbeltown was 23 years old, built for a war that had ended before some of her final crew were born, transferred to Britain as surplus equipment in a deal signed to keep the Royal Navy's convoy escorts afloat, not to strike at Germany's newest battleship. She was never meant to fight Tirpitz directly. She was built to become a bomb, driven at full speed into a target no gun could reliably hit, and to do it once. That single, unrepeatable act of demolition kept one of the most powerful warships ever built effectively out of the Atlantic War for the rest of its existence. The dock gate she destroyed was not rebuilt for over a decade. The obsolete destroyer that did it never fired an angry shot in her own defense. She did not need to. She only needed to arrive.